Thank you, Madam President. Let me say first, as my colleagues generally have, how much respect I've developed over the 3 sessions I've been here for Senator Harp and the work she does on the Appropriations Committee. There's people, I tend to feel that I judge people by the trajectory of my respect for them. And she's somebody who I have grown to appreciate and admire the more that I've seen her deal with these issues. I had the pleasure of being at a conference with her last fall, and I have to say I was sat in amazement as she responded on issue after issue, while I was simply sitting there trying to figure out what the acronyms were. And she was engaged in every aspect of the conversation. A real command, to my mind, of what's involved in this budget. She has been in the frying pan and for some reason now seems to be wishing to jump into the fire. But I wish her well in that, and I think that if anyone can do it, from what I've seen of her, she's the person. And Representative Walker as well. I think both of them have put in a tireless job and understand what they're doing. I don't claim to have that expertise, and I'm not going to. I don't have the knowledge of the budget that my friend Senator Kaine does either. And I feel like that analysis has been presented to some extent and will be further in the course of the conversation. So I won't attempt to add to something that I don't think I can duplicate. I will say that as I say sometimes when I'm here, I feel that I've been privileged to have a kind of a historical perspective, which perhaps I can bring to bear in these situations. And I was thinking about it sitting here that I feel like I've had 3 acts in my political career. 3 acts is kind of the normal number that you get. There are plays that have 5 acts in them. They don't usually end very well. So 3 acts, if that's what I have, were a term that I served here in the legislature back in the 80s, and a period that I was involved very much in grassroots efforts during the fight over the state income tax, and my return in 2011 to this chamber. To go back to my first term, I was here in 1985 and 1986, and they were flush times, I think, like we have not seen since in Connecticut. We had substantial surpluses based on existing revenues and on current services budget growth. We were under no pressure to make cuts in the budget. And in fact, with Republican control in both chambers and a Democratic governor who I think was at heart a fiscally conservative or a fiscal moderate anyways, we were able to cut taxes considerably and still increase spending. And when I say we increased spending, let me say we really increased spending. We passed 2 budgets while I was here. The 2 budgets were at 8% and a 10% budget increase. And at the time, I remember when I first came up here, actually the day after the election, we had a caucus. And 2 senators, I hardly knew anyone in the group, but 2 senators grabbed me and took me out to dinner. That was Tom Scott and Ted Lovegrove. And the 3 of us, as I sat there at dinner, the argument was, how much are we going to cut the budget? And I thought, my goodness, these Republican senators sure are a bunch of conservatives. It wasn't until I found out later those were the 2, I was eating with the 2 conservatives in the caucus. And it wasn't a liberal caucus by any means, but it didn't really have the will or the vision to make tough decisions on the budget when tough decisions were not demanded. And the budget was increased, even at the time, I thought more than was wise, despite the revenues coming in. But honestly, we had an eye on the next election, and I think that that influenced people's decisions. I'll admit it. And I'll say this. That is to say, Republicans make mistakes too, just like Democrats. And I feel when we get in the budget discussions frequently, there's a certain amount of saying, well, your Republican governor did this, and we're doing it, so you can't complain about it. I would say I complained about it from the outside when my Republican governors did it. I hope I would have had the nerve to complain about it from the inside. But I don't feel that the mistakes of one party are justification for the mistakes of the other or for any of our mistakes. We all have to judge our own situation, our current situation, and react as well as we can. After I was defeated, I sat on the sidelines, but I was still paying attention. And the next 2 years, 1987, 1988 budgets, the spending increases were 14% and 16% in 2 consecutive years. At that time, John Larson was the president of the Senate, a man who I don't see much of these days, but I liked extremely well when I served with him. Really thought he was just a fine fellow and somebody who had his head screwed on straight, generally speaking. And I sat at home thinking, John Larson must know something that I don't know to allow the spending to go up by those kinds of percentages. But I think what I discovered was that you can't, no one knows enough to be able to do that. That's always going to catch up with you. And when that caught up with us was in 1991, very shortly thereafter. That spending spree led to its inevitable crisis. And in 1991, the proposal came out to impose a state income tax. Well, I was the executive director of a group that was set up at that time, the Connecticut Taxpayers Committee, which became the lead group in opposition to the state income tax. And it was an interesting experience. I remember it maybe more vividly than anybody else in this chamber would. We fought it in terms of bringing attention to it and trying to have events and trying to put pressure on legislators who were seen as being wavering on the issue of the income tax. From February, when Governor Weicker first made the proposal, all the way until the tax passed in August. And Governor Weicker, we'd have protests and rallies and events and so forth, the kind of thing I so love to do. And Governor Weicker would say, it's the same 100 people. And I can say now that he wasn't far off. We would have those rallies, and I'd look around and realize I knew everybody, or I'd be waiting for them to show up and think, where's those guys that always come through for us when we do this? It was a relatively small group of people opposed to it. The income tax passed in August, and at that point, the opposition to the income tax exploded. I think this is one of the things that people don't remember about it particularly. And when you think back on things like the rally that was held in Hartford October 5th, 1991, on that side of the Capitol, where we had Hartford Current said 40,000 people, the state police said 65,000 people. It was a big rally. That was well after the income tax passed, and that was a rally in favor of repeal of the income tax. And in fact, the legislature repealed the income tax. And not surprisingly, the governor vetoed the repeal, and we were never able to get a 2/3 vote to override the veto of the repeal. So we've had the income tax ever since. Now, one of the things that has been mentioned here is the deal, essentially, which is to say we will give you this additional revenue through a state income tax if you will accept the controls of a spending cap. That was a deal between parties up here at the Capitol. The people were too smart to make that deal. The people knew that if the legislators had that revenue source available to them, they would find a way to spend the money. And that is exactly what happened. I think the groups that knuckled under in making the deal, the people who were basically insiders to this process, were the ones that were kidding themselves. The only way we're going to have fiscal restraint here is by us exercising it individually as legislators, not by trying to make a rule for ourselves, which we can always find a way to get out of when the time comes. The second thing I'd say about that moment of tax increases is that it's very easy to say you're against tax increases when no one wants a tax increase. At the moment at which it seems like there's no alternative to a tax increase, that's the moment in which you have to have the resolve to stick to your position. And I honestly believe it's the only way to enforce fiscal discipline, to say that we have a certain tax rate in place, the tax revenues will grow as the economy grows, and that is the amount of additional spending which is available to the state. If the tax revenues flatten out, or even if they decrease slightly, then it's up to the state to find ways to decrease spending, not to increase the burden on the taxpayers at the very point that they can least afford to absorb that increase. So here I am in the chamber, in many ways reaping the result of a policy which I have generally been in opposition to for 25 years, and reaping the result, I might say, of over 7% yearly increase in state spending ever since that income tax was passed. There's no way that we could do that without coming into the kind of crisis that we have been in for the last 3 years. When we have the money, when we had the money when I was here in 85 and 86, we spent it. And we spent it in many cases because we said, well, we have these unmet needs. We have things that we underspent on because we had a more difficult time economically in the early 80s, and we need to catch up with those things. I think we overspent even then when we had the money. But we have continued to overspend even when we don't have the money. And that's the situation that we're in today. And the worst part of it is, when you overspend without the money, you do it by borrowing. And what we're doing now is borrowing on massive scale. I said when we were talking about the proposal for the Yukon funding that Secretary Barnes, when asked what happened to the $1.4 billion cap on bonding, said, well, we're still under that cap because it's now $1.8 billion. I want you to think about what, not only the kind of the frightening implications of what we mean by a cap, but the amount of increase between $1.4 and $1.8 billion in yearly bonding when we already have the highest per capita debt of any state in the country, and a debt which is becoming a major item to service in our budget, a cost that is going to be with us and it is going to plague us however much fiscal restraint we show from now on for many years down the road. We had Yukon last week that we borrowed for. We had Jackson Labs in the previous session. We had, if I may be forgiven for mentioning it, the busway, and many other projects. And I heard in the debate on Jackson Labs for more than one of my colleagues here something that I found an almost terrifying statement when we're talking about borrowing for state spending, which is sometimes you have to take a chance. I thought, I'm almost glad the people of Connecticut don't pay any attention to us, because I'd hate to hear them say such a thing from a legislator, as sometimes you just have to take a chance. To my mind, that's like the guy who's in debt driving out to Foxwoods. And I would not advise him to make that trip, and I wouldn't advise us to pass this budget. I feel that we are going in the wrong direction, that we have been going in the wrong direction for as long as I have been watching our direction. And not only have we not changed direction, we have not even taken our foot off the accelerator. This is what worries me. And I'm convinced that we are going to have to not only take our foot off the accelerator, but put it on the brake. And I think that we have a wall that we are going to hit, and we're going to hit it no matter what we do. And the faster we're going, the more the suffering is going to be. I look at the state of California and what they went through a few years ago in terms of budget cuts. The budget cuts to higher education out there, over 20%. I don't think they had no more desire to do it, certainly, than we would, to make a cut like that. And I would say even to my most conservative friends that I know that there's no way that you can cut a budget like that 20% or more in a year without doing tremendous damage to a system. It's simply, you can't cut that, you can't cut that much out and think you're only getting fat at that point. That's why I think we have to be doing it every year, and we have to be doing steadily so that it doesn't end up being a disaster. But we're not doing that. We haven't reached that realization. Events have not forced us to do it, and it seems to me that we have lacked the wisdom to do it voluntarily. I think this budget continues us in the wrong direction. I'm sorry to see it before us in the form it is. When the governor brought forth the budget in February, I was not impressed, but I thought it was a kind of a base document that there was a chance for considerable improvement. It still has, to my mind, some of the most painful things in it, including the large cut to the hospitals. And it still has, in my mind, some of the things that should not be there. So, regretfully, but firmly, I will vote against this budget. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you.